Some of the stuff at the beginning, stuff we already talked about, so like the first 10 slides of stuff we talked about, I think. Bats, boom. Cows, boom. There you go. We talked about this. So what's R naught? Anybody know what R naught is? Yeah, so it's how many people one person can infect with something. So the higher that number, the more infectious it is. So like I said, we talked about a lot of this stuff already. We talked about this too, herd immunity. So things that spread really easy because maybe they're aerosolized, you need to make sure a higher percentage of the population is immune against that or it'll spread. That's it. People that we worry about that can't get vaccinated or that might be susceptible to different kinds of infectious diseases like this, people without a fully working immune system, you all know that, that's obvious. People on chemotherapy treatment whose immune system is weakened because they have cancer, that's especially worse if they actually have an immune system cancer like leukemia, because not only is the chemotherapy impacting their immune response, but they have cancer that's impacting their immune system. People with HIV, that's another obvious one because it hurts the immune response. Newborn babies that are too young to be vaccinated, elderly people whose immune response wanes, and many of the people that are in the hospital because they're in the hospital because they're ill for some reason. So those are people that are usually susceptible. We talked about this too. One of the first things that has to happen for a virus or any kind of pathogen to cause infection is it has to adhere to your cells somehow. This one virus image down here at the bottom shows where they actually kind of surf, they roll across the surface until they find the receptor that they need to have attachment, and then they attach and they can cause an infection. Like I said, this is like first time we've talked about a lot of this. We haven't talked about this graph. Or did we? I think maybe we have talked about this like way towards the beginning. Yeah. So this is just the kind of stages of an infectious disease. You have an incubation period. This is time along the x-axis, along the y-axis. It's the intensity of the symptoms. As you go up, you have an incubation period. The virus, the bacterium, whatever's there, it's attaching, it's starting to grow, but it hasn't caused enough damage yet to actually cause symptoms. So at this point, it's an infection. Once one cell technically is damaged, it becomes a disease process. Do you see that with symptoms? No. But eventually you start to see mild symptoms. More and more cells are impacted and they're harmed. And those initial kind of feelings of discomfort and this kind of those vague feelings you have when you're starting to get sick, like kind of tired, maybe coffee, sneeze, those initial kind of symptoms, that's called a prodrome. So this little bump here is in green is the prodromal stage. More and more cells are damaged, the infection is, the disease process at this point is getting worse. More cells are damaged, so you have more symptoms until you reach the height of the infection. And what can happen at this point, your immune system starts to fight it off. You go into a convalescence period where you start to feel better. Not everybody gets the opportunity to go into this convalescent period. Some people die from infection. So in that we did talk about this a little bit before, but this is the prodromal stage. We talked about this too. Droplet transmissions, usually within, depends on what book you read, it's usually a meter or less, so you're essentially sneezing in somebody's face at that point. Anything beyond that is considered indirect because you're further removed from the person. So direct versus indirect contact. We talked about pheromones as well. Okay, so some of the stuff we haven't talked about. So some of these viruses, influenza is a good example of it, can have different mutations that allow it to change enough where your immune system doesn't recognize it, even if it's been exposed to it before. One of those mechanisms by which influenza virus does it is called antigenic drift. That occurs in influenza types A and B, and those are small little mutations. So you have these spike proteins on the surface of, say, influenza virus, like hemoglobin is one of them, HA, allows those HA fibers or spikes on the influenza virus recognize respiratory epithelial cells. You have a flu vaccine generally every year. That flu vaccine is going to recognize different strains of influenza virus. Why do you need to get a flu vaccine every year is because you have little mutations and things like that HA, and that means that the vaccine you had last year might not be good for the virus you're exposed to this year because there's like a point mutation on one of those spike proteins. It just takes a little tiny little shift where your immune system might not recognize them. Those little tiny changes are called antigenic drift. So they just slowly drift in your little mutations. Antigenic shift usually only happens in influenza A. Those are big changes. So those are like reassortments between different influenza viruses, like huge pieces of the genomic material swapping between different strains of influenza virus. Those are the ones, if you have an influenza virus that usually, again, type A, that goes through antigenic shift, what happens is you have, say, let's use a chicken example. You have livestock using in close vicinity to people. So you have a chicken that has a chicken influenza virus, then in close proximity to people to become exposed to a human influenza virus. You end up with a human influenza virus and the bird influenza virus in the same chicken, and they can swap genetic material. So then you have this kind of hybrid that has some properties of a bird virus and some properties of a human influenza virus. When you're exposed to that as a human being, your immune system does not know what to do with that because it looks like a bird virus, kind of. So those are the ones we worry about causing pandemics. These are the ones you always hear about, H1, whatever, avian influenza, bird flu, swine flu. Those are type A, and they have big changes genomically through a shift, an antigenic shift. Does that make sense? Good. Okay. Okay, this is what we just talked about. So again, antigenic shift, little mutations, antigenic shift, or antigenic drift, little mutations, antigenic shift, big changes. Talking about this. They use a big example here, but it's the same thing. It's just swine flu versus bird flu. Yeah.
So let's say like we have every disease today, you know how it's like nearly likely now is kind of popping out. What are the chances that we're gonna have to develop like an updated vaccine because it's popping out due to like?
So the measles vaccine. So MMR. We'll talk about some of this today. Measles, mumps, and rubella. So that vaccine is pretty long-lived. There could be actually lifetime immunity to that vaccine. However, if you're in an environment where you're exposed to it a lot, what they usually do is they draw titers on you, so they're looking to see if you have antibodies against measles. If you don't, like you were in a hospital or something, if you have a lower antibody titer against measles, they'll have you get another MMR vaccine. You could boost it. So it's for measles, mumps, and rubella, which is German measles. It's like a shorter lived. Similar to measles, not as severe, but similar. It covers all three of those. Most of the resurgence of measles is because of lack of vaccine coverage, so it's a lack of herd immunity. So that's probably going to see more measles actually. Unless you've had the vaccine, then you should be immune to it. Especially like over these age and years. Like it usually takes a while until you really have to worry about that vaccine starting to like use some immunity. I'm not concerned about it, so it's usually not an issue. Just like for the influenza example, shift versus drift, this shift versus drift can happen in other types of viruses as well. For example, here is COVID-19. It's the same thing. Drift is gradual, small changes. Shift, big change. I mean, that's a different virus almost at that point. So they behave very differently. Okay, so let's talk about measles here a little bit. So measles is transmitted through droplet transmission and aerosol transmission. Measles can spread pretty far. During the prodromal period, you have these kind of nondescript symptoms that are similar to a lot of other things. Fever, dry cough, runny nose, kind of like a cold. You have a rash for about a week or two. People that are infected with it are infectious about 4 days before they even have a rash. They don't necessarily know they have measles, so they could be out spreading measles to other people without knowing they have measles. It's one of the things we worry about with measles because they can spread very easily. And if they don't know they have it, it's a problem. There are a lot of sequelae, which are these symptoms you have after having an infection, so post-infectious sequelae. The central nervous system complications may occur within days or even years after people have measles. About 140,000 people have died worldwide of measles in 2018. Those numbers are generally taken up here over the past 6 or 7 years, but there is none of this significant number of people that die from measles every year. This is what it looks like. One of the things is pathognomonic to measles. So what pathognomonic means is it's a symptom that's indicative of a specific kind of infection. So complex spots are something you really only see with measles. There's nothing else you really see complex spots with. You can see over there on the left-hand side of those images, that's what complex spots look like. And again, you don't really see complex spots with any kind of infectious disease process besides measles. Nothing else really causes that. If you ever see anything, for those of you that go to med school, dental school, any kind of health-related thing, you see complex spots, we're talking about measles, because there's nothing else that makes complex spots. What else? You can see some different things up there: runny nose, cough, conjunctivitis, things like that, skin rash, and the complex spots. And the different days in which you see those, you don't need to know that, but it just shows you there if you're so interested. Some of the things that might become long-lasting have a measles infection after the infection itself. Again, there could be central nervous system involvement. It could actually lead to encephalitis, so that's going to be involving the cerebral cortex. Could lead to deafness and blindness, pneumonia, that can cause death in children if they're infected with measles. You can get ear infections that could lead to deafness. You can get, excuse me, you can get a subacute sclerosing encephalitis, which is when the central nervous system starts to degenerate based on this type of infection. That doesn't happen very often, about 1 in a million times. That's what 10 to the -6 means. So this is one of the reasons we're about measles. Does it matter if you get a measles rash? No, whatever, it's a rash, it doesn't matter. But there are a lot of things associated with measles infection after the infection itself that are obviously very bad from the list of things that are up there. So that is actually a lot of the reasons we want people to get vaccinated against measles. It's not the measles infection itself, it's all the long-lasting effects after the infection. Disease can be pretty bad, or if not lethal. The main vaccine for it is an attenuated vaccine, or the component that's for measles, I should say, is attenuated. So is the measles, mumps, or rubella vaccine. So that is attenuated. So it means the measles component is a weakened version of measles. So if you have somebody that's super duper immunocompromised and you give them a measles vaccine, or measles, mumps, or rubella vaccine, there's a chance they could get measles. So those are some of the people within a population where you can't get the vaccine because you don't want to get measles. Okay, chickenpox. So chickenpox is a herpes virus. They have changed the name of that. They've changed the genus. They call it varicella zoster now. They used to call it herpes zoster. Why do you think they changed that? Yeah. Your daughter has herpes zoster virus. Everybody hears herpes, they associate it with more genital herpes, not chickenpox. So they call it varicella zoster. It's a herpes virus. It's related to herpes virus. It behaves like a herpes virus. It's a herpes virus. So what happens is you have the prodromal period. Again, you get these vague symptoms. The R0 is between 10 and 12, so one person can infect between 10 and 12 people. 14 to 16 days after exposure, you start getting sore throat, headache, cough, fever, 1 to 2 days before the rash. The rash is super itchy. You scratch it, and it leads to scarring, so it's hard to keep little kids from scratching it. Contagious from 2 to 3 days before the rash until after the blisters have started to get pressed over. And usually takes about a week and a half for all those blisters to kind of resolve. So what happens with this? So you have a chickenpox. Most people in here probably have chickenpox vaccine now. When I was a kid, they didn't have chickenpox vaccine. So you get chickenpox, you get this rash, and then the virus goes and hangs out in your dorsal root ganglia in your central nervous system at the base of your back. Then later on in life, if you become immunocompromised because you're elderly or whatever, that can reemerge out of those dorsal root ganglia and cause shingles. So it's the same virus. So if you've never been exposed to the virus before, you always start out with chickenpox. You never skip, you don't skip chickenpox and go to shingles. You have to go through the treatment, have them both. Yeah.
Why does it sit in those over ganglia?
that's how a lot of herpes viruses behave. They just have a propensity to go to the nerves. So, a couple things with that, and there's been some different explanations to this. So shingles hurts a lot more when you have shingles than when you have chickenpox as a kid. The real reason that is because it admits at your nerve endings. So that's gonna hurt because it's where your nerve endings are. Some of the older textbooks would say, it's like, well, younger kids when they have chickenpox haven't been exposed to as many pain stimuli, so they don't have as much of a repertoire of different kind of like painful things that happen to them. The real reason is chickenpox, you inhale it into your lungs, and it spreads from there, across the rash and everything. Shingles comes out of your nerve ending, so yeah, that's going to hurt the big nerve endings. Those of you that, well, probably those of you haven't had chickenpox. So the chickenpox themselves are small pus-filled little vesicles, primarily in the chest. Again, you inhale those. Virus exists like a plasmid in the nuclei and spinal cord ganglia, specifically dorsal root ganglia. And the vaccine exists. I can't remember when the vaccine came out, but it was after I was past that point because I already had chickenpox by that point. By the time. They used to actually have kids come together and like kind of swap chickenpox between one another. It's obviously not the greatest, but it does kind of work. You can get a Shingrix vaccine if you're above 55. So if you've been exposed to chickenpox, you've had chickenpox, you're worried about getting shingles later on in life, they give you the Shingrix vaccine, which is essentially just the measles vaccine times like 7, I think. It's just a super duper high dose, just to re-stimulate your immune system. So if anything pops out of the dorsal root ganglia, your immune system's like, wow. It's just so it just kind of gets it back up to date. Spreads by direct droplet contact for chickenpox, and again, hangs out in those dorsal root ganglia. This is what shingles looks like. Very painful. I've not been fortunate enough to have that one yet. Can't take no more. No shingles. The difference between chickenpox and measles. Again, one of the main differences between chickenpox and measles, you're going to see symptom-wise is you're going to see those complex spots for measles. You will never, ever see complex spots for chickenpox. It's just not a thing. It's not how that disease works. It just doesn't feel like that. And you see this kind of fever and some kind of nondescript things. Chickenpox, usually, especially in kids, they tend to kind of have decreased appetite. You can get some conjunctival kind of interactions with the eyes, like red in the eyes from measles. You tend not to see that with chickenpox. Measles, you can have some like red blotchiness along the forehead. You tend not to see that with chickenpox. You tend to see most of the rash kind of emanate from like the upper chest. But I would say the main difference between the two symptom-wise are those complex spots, because you won't see that for anything else besides measles. Okay, mumps. So the second M in MMR. So that's mumps, prodromal period, again, nondescript stuff, low-grade fever, tired, runny nose. Except for mumps, you have swelling of the salivary gland, so peritonitis. So that is pathognomonic, so that's the big of mumps. So you can see it. You have swelling of the bronchial salivary gland. So that's mumps. One of the main reasons we worry about mumps is because, especially in males, it can cause sterility. So there was a big push back with the original MMR vaccine to make sure you get everybody vaccinated, because we didn't want people. I mean, that's how the population goes away, right? I mean, if you have a high population of males that are sterile, you have no more people. So that's one of the main pushes for the mumps. These mumps will develop. 2 to 3 weeks for symptoms to appear, infections for a day or 2 before salivary glands swell, and they noticeably swell and get very large. I have never, ever seen a case of mumps. I have never met anyone else that's ever actually, within recent history, seen a case of mumps like in a hospital setting. This one seems to be pretty much away. But as we see more vaccine hesitancy, less people taking that MMR vaccine, there's a chance you might see this in your lifetimes. Your parents, you definitely, your grandparents have probably seen mumps, I'm sure. But over the past 30 years or so, never seen it. 30% of affected individuals are asymptomatic. Some of these things, that's why you kind of worry about starting to see them in the population. Because if you go to the physician to get treated for measles, mumps, or German measles, which is rubella, they most likely, unless they're an older physician, they've never seen those in person before, they've seen them in textbook. So, kind of shoot a headline and stuff. This hasn't existed for a long time. The same thing's true for polio. Those people haven't seen the case, the practices haven't seen the case of polio. Because polio has gotten super duper close to being globally eradicated. And I think that we're probably not going to get there, unfortunately, now. One of the reasons that we don't worry about mumps as much as like the measles component of the MMR vaccine is because the R naught is less. So instead of being able to affect, depending on the study for measles, anywhere between 10 up to 18 per individual person, this one's only about 4 to 7. So it's not as infectious, it doesn't spread as easily. So you don't see it. It's a childhood disease usually. So individuals past the age of 10, they usually have more complicated symptoms. The older you are and you have mumps, the more severe it is. Some of the things you see associated with it, some of the common kind of symptoms, meningitis, encephalitis, that can lead to learning disabilities and deafness, inflammation of the testes leading to sterility, inflammation of the pancreas, inflammation of the ovaries and breast tissue. For whatever reason, mumps tends to have a propensity to go towards things involved in reproduction, which makes it a problem, along with some of these other horrible symptoms too. The mumps component of the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine is also an attenuated virus. So there's a chance if you give somebody an MMR vaccine and they're very immunosuppressed. I'll give you an example, like those necrotizing fasciitis cases we were talking about. If you gave that person an MMR vaccine, you probably just gave them measles and mumps. Because they don't have an immune response, even for that weakened virus.
Would they die from it though?
Potentially. You can die from things that normally don't cause infections in people, like even some environmental pathogens. Even some environmental microorganisms that typically don't cause pathogenesis in people, you start to see them sometimes causing pathogenesis in people if they're very immunosuppressed because they can't fight off even the kind of like just normal nothingness. So that's why you try to get herd immunity, so you vaccinate to actually protect those people that can't get it because you don't want them to get these kinds of things. The last component of the MMR vaccine is rubella, also referred to as German measles, are not between 5 and 7, so it doesn't spread anywhere near as easily as measles does. It's shorter lived than measles. In adults, infection during the first trimester can result in something called congenital rubella syndrome and can result in the death of the fetus, unfortunately. And a bunch of other congenital defects that they might have that are lifelong if they would survive through birth. That is a attenuated component also. So you give somebody an MMR vaccine that has an immune response, you could give them measles, mumps, or rubella. So you just gave them the entire thing you were trying to protect them against. So that's why it's so important to keep the herd immunity up, the percentage of people that are probably vaccinated up. Sometimes what they will do is women that are pregnant, they'll get vaccinated before they actually become pregnant if they're worried about the virus or the vaccine becoming kind of waning. That doesn't tend to happen with this vaccine. We'll talk about that later, but there's a reason for that. If you take an inactivated pathogen as a vaccine and you inject it into a person versus a weakened virus or bacterium or whatever, and you inject it into the person, that attenuated vaccine, the virus or bacterium, whatever, once it gets into the human body, somebody with a normal immune response, yeah, it will make them sick, but it's going to grow a little bit. The virus is going to replicate, the bacterial cells are going to replicate and make more bacterial cells. So you inject them with this much dose, but really you end up giving them this much dose. If you give them something that's inactivated, what you dose them with is what they get. There's no, like, it's like almost like a self-booster. Like it boosts itself as soon as you inject it for a tank with it. Inactivated is where it's going. We'll talk about that when we talk about vaccines here in a couple of weeks. This is what German measles looks like. Sometimes you'll see this referred to as 3-day measles. It's just not as long lasting as measles. It's similar to measles, but doesn't have the same necessarily severity of symptoms. Another virus, and there's actually a vaccine for this now. It's an mRNA vaccine that they came out with. After they came out with the mRNA vaccine for COVID-19, for SARS-CoV-2. It's called respiratory syncytial virus. You see this oftentimes in very young kids or elderly adults, and it can make them very sick, if not kill them, and people end up in the hospital for this all the time. Usually, this is one of the ones that's endemic. You find pretty much all over the place, at least in the United States. You see a set number of this every year, except around when SARS-CoV-2 was raging, you would see RSV, and then RSV like tanked. And then as soon as we all came out of quarantine and everything, RSV cases went back up because everybody was in quarantine, and a lot of people that were out and about were wearing masks and doing all kinds of things. Well, it's a respiratory virus, so that stops the spread of it too. So we saw RSV cases tank. Not anymore, in the back, but I don't think everyone will wear masks the rest of their life either, so kind of how this stuff works. U.S. infants infected less than 2 years of age, about 500,000 ER visits, 57,000 hospitalizations. No, you don't need to know these numbers, but the rates stay around the same kind of range. They don't change, not for RSV. 100 to 500 deaths a year, about 14,000 deaths annually in U.S. adults. Those tend to be people older than 65. And because their immune system starts to kind of wane as they get older, and they can get pretty sick with this. My mom actually had this when we moved down here. She was in the hospital for a while. People that are like younger, middle age, they usually don't have much symptoms from this. You feel a little discomfort like you have a cold or something. But if you're older, it doesn't go away as easy. What happens is you have synestia formation of lungs. We can talk about this and talk about viruses. So you get these large multinucleated cells. But what happens is the virus is actually blooding off from your host cells and taking membrane with it. Eventually, once it takes enough membrane, as those viral particles start coming out of the cell, being exocytosed out of the cell, is it causes enough membrane damage that your cells start to kind of congeal together. So you get these big synestia multinucleated cells that have a bunch of nuclei in it, because all your cells just kind of pull out together. So that's why it's called respiratory syncytial virus. Treatments, passive immunization, there is a vaccine now, and then there's some different drugs you can give too. Oftentimes you give these patients steroids because sometimes the immune system can kind of overreact to it, so you might have to suppress that a little bit. Smallpox, I hope we do not see this one, because this one is globally eradicated. So smallpox, there's only two places, I think I might have talked about this before too, there's only two places on the planet that we know smallpox exists. One of them is the Center for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia. Another one is Vector Lab in the Russian Federation, and I don't remember where Vector Lab's at. Okay. I don't remember where Vector Lab's at. Vector with a K, I believe. We keep those in case there is actually ever like a smallpox like outbreak. We have like strains to do research on. That's the only two places which exist. Do they exist other places? Yeah, probably, because if you know anything about like Russian history, there was a lot of states that broke off the old USSR, and they had smallpox.
It's like closest like
Yeah, I thought they had it like Iceland in the middle of nowhere, because you don't want this to obviously that. We put ours in Atlanta because good Lord. Yeah, I thought they had it like in Siberia somewhere or something. Yeah, they have it where you can't get to it. We have ours in downtown Atlanta. I mean, you can't make this stuff up.
Something tells me it would still be pretty hard to get to.
It would be pretty hard to get to. The way these labs work, smallpox is BSL-4 lab, The BSL-4 lab is surrounded by a bunch of BSL-3 labs, and then the BSL-3 labs are surrounded by a bunch of BSL-2 labs. So you would be very hard pressed to get all the way into that 4. Yes. Through interlocks and security and, yeah. Just the process of walking through there, if you had access, would take you time. And getting back out would be very unlikely.
Do you have to maintain the small box though? Like you're keeping it?
It's in cold storage, it's liquid.
But like, you don't have to do really anything.
Nobody's doing anything, at least not that I've ever heard of, nobody's making that for years. The only reason they really keep it, I'd say, because in case there's an outbreak or something again. The main reason we're about there being an outbreak or something again is because it's globally eradicated now. So they had smallpox vaccine in here? Yeah, okay, so usually there's a couple, but usually, I mean, most people don't have it anymore because it's eradicated, they don't get it. But if anybody ever got a hold of one of those isolates, say from one of those states that broke off the old USSR and released it, we're all those, except because we're not immune to it. They'll give it to military personnel sometimes too, if they're worried about them coming into contact with things like that. We worry about this for bioterrorism. This doesn't exist actually.
Yeah, here's that, some of the biggest people that is they're actually required in the medical field or your chronic just a check.
Early kind of vaccination for this involved like variolation. They take like out of the pustules of like an infected person that survived an infection, and then they use that to holy God, inoculate someone else. They use that as kind of like a preliminary vaccine. Generally, we use the cowpox vaccine. So cowpox and smallpox are pretty decently related to one another. So if you inject somebody with cowpox, they'll have an immunological response to smallpox pretty well. That vaccine has existed since the late 1700s. Humans are the only reservoir, so again, really we're the only place that exists. So naturally, that thing doesn't exist anymore. If it comes back out, it's because someone's brought it back out. It's the thought process, at least. Death is primarily due to antibody-antigen complexes in the blood, leads to a bunch of coagulation, since it starts blocking off your blood vessels, and then block out blood vessels, can't get oxygen to your organs and tissues, leads to necrosis of the tissue and organ. That's pretty much it. Can lead to permanent disfigurement, can lead to blindness potentially. A related virus to this is monkeypox. Monkeypox nowhere as bad as smallpox. Usually you get that through direct contact. That is very rarely ever lethal. It's not something that would kill you usually, but monkeypox is something that does. Okay, on to another virus. So parvo B19 causes something called Fifth's disease. Why is it called Fifth disease? Because the old terminology used to throw these different rash-causing diseases into different categories and call them first, second, third, fourth, and fifth disease. First disease is measles. Second disease is scarlet fever. Third disease, again, these terminologies are like super antiquated, so I'm trying to pull this out of my memory too. Third disease is German measles. Fourth disease isn't a thing, it doesn't really exist. They goofed up the diagnostics on it a long time ago. So it's like some kind of staphylococcus toxin or something, or it was measles, or one of the other, like 1, 2, 3 was one of those ones. And they misdiagnosed it, so there's never been any proof that there's ever actually was a fourth disease. It was just misdiagnosed first, second, or third. So first is measles, second is scarlet fever, third is German measles, fourth is VS, and fifth is parvo B19. Parvo B19 causes something called slap cheek syndrome because the kids look like you smacked them in the cheek. That's something that's indicative of this kind of virus. It's called, for that reason, slap cheek disease. Transient fever with the rash, about 5 to 7 days. And you get this sock and glove syndrome, especially in teens and adults. And you can see that down there at the bottom. Sometimes you can get transient joint disease or reactive arthritis. 80 and 90% of us are seropositive, which means we have antibodies against it. So this is something that we've all been exposed to much like. Remember we talked about reactive arthritis. This is one of the infectious pathogens that cause that. And what happens is there are components of parvovirus. They're similar to components you find in your joints, and your immune system can attack those components of your joints, leaving when parvovirus is gone, leading to a reactive arthritis. And I talked about writer and everything in here, so that's writer syndrome. So that's reactive arthritis. The bacterial example that gives that and does that typically talk about Campylobacter, which is respiratory syndrome.
So, okay, so there's some options, measles, scarlet fever, rubella, Duke's disease, and then that. Just general question, what's the difference between a German measles and like?
Measles?
Yeah.
So it's a different virus. So German measles tends to be shorter duration of symptoms than measles, and the disease process tends to not be as severe. So it can do, don't get me wrong, if you cause some bad things, it can cause like termination of like a pregnancy, it can do things. But for the most part, German measles is a lot less severe than measles. There's something else I was gonna it's because the rash is similar. HIV. So this is one of the places where the R naught gets a little kind of odd. So the R naught for one person that's infected with HIV can infect 2 to 5 people with HIV. Or give HIV to 2 to 5 people. Why? That's terrible. HIV isn't something that's spread except through like sexual transmission or like bloodborne, like through needles or something like that. So if you're not having those interactions, the R naught for that person is really 0. So that comes with like a little asterisk next to it because it's not really 2. It's 2 to 5 based on situation. I guess it's a nice way to put it. Remember we talked about HIV virus as a reverse transcriptase because it wants to essentially get that genetic material into your genetic material where it can exist as a provirus. And we talked about the rest of that before. You do not need to know all these. It's just to show you that most of us have been exposed to a whole crap load of different herpes viruses. There are a bunch of them. Human herpes virus 1 through 8, we'll talk about here in a little bit. Usually through direct contact and droplet transmission. Viral genome exists as a plasmid for durations of a person's life. If you've been exposed to herpes virus, you're always going to be carrying some of that with you. Infect through mucosal membranes. And again, let me walk through these a little bit, even though you don't really have to know in detail, but let me walk through them. So HHV 1 and 2. Human herpes virus 1 is usually what we refer to as cold sores around the mouth. 85% of the population has been exposed to that. Human herpes virus 2 is what is usually referred to as genital herpes. That's about 17% of the population. As my PhD advisor used to teach this, due to the juxtaposition of mucous membranes, HHV1 and HHV2 are both genital herpes. I don't think I need to have that talk in here. We understand that, right? Thank God. Good. We'll have that talk. So, those can both cause genital herpes. For instance, you have human herpes virus 1, you can find congenital herpes. So that's the carriage for those. And if you look down through the rest of these, 99%, 90%, 90%, 85%, 85%, it means we pretty much all have been exposed to these. Herpes viruses are ubiquitous. They're all over the place. Chickenpox, 99% of the population has been exposed to that. Now, most because they've had a vaccine. Before that, most people would get it naturally. They get the disease process. Human herpes virus 4 causes Epstein-Barr virus. That's what EBV is. Mononucleosis, 85 to 90% carriage. Most of us have been exposed to that. I've had mono more than once. Not fun. Cytomegalovirus, CMV. Depending on the study that's looked at this, it's anywhere between 50 to 90%. You see that a lot of times you worry about with transplant patients. When they're compromised, they can get a cytomegalovirus infection, and that could potentially be fatal. because they're on immunosuppressive therapy. Human herpes virus 6 causes infant rashes, about 85% of the population has been exposed to that. HHV 7 causes a rash, about 85% has been exposed to that. So all to kind of impart upon you that most people carry about 5 human herpes viruses on them, or in them. It's their everywhere. The last one, not so much. The last one is called Kaposi's sarcoma. So that's only 1 to 5% carry. Kaposi's sarcoma is a type of cancer, a very rare sarcoma type of cancer, that you tend to only see that kind of lesion on people's skin that have advanced AIDS, because they're immunosuppressed so badly that it makes them susceptible to that virus. People that are immunocompetent usually take care of that virus pretty easily. So if you see somebody with Kaposi's sarcoma, they probably have AIDS, not HIV, AIDS. Because even people with HIV still have some of the immunological response. Once you get to the point of having AIDS, you have a very decreased immunological response. You can get that type of infection. Just like you get things like oral thrush. Oral thrush is usually associated with immune deficiency, things like AIDS in adults as well. So that's when you get essentially yeast infection in the mouth. You don't see that in adults unless they have something going on. You see it in babies sometimes, but you don't see it in adults. This is what HSV1 and HSV2 look like. So this is what genital herpes looks like. You can have it on the finger, depending on, I think you understand that. You can get on the finger, that's called herpes whitlow. That's a specific name based on where you find it. This is what it looks like. Alright. So again, most people have been exposed to this. I guess talking about some more cancers now. Papillomaviruses, so human papillomaviruses cause warts. There's a bunch of different kinds of types of human HPV viruses. They can cause some things that are not associated with sexual activity, things like plantar warts, but also things like venereal warts, so that's from sexual transmission. Treatment, you can physically destroy them, topical application of drugs, injection of interferon alpha, there's different things you can do. The ones we worry about when it comes to human papillomaviruses, there is a set of specific strains of human papillomavirus that are specifically associated with cervical, anal, penile cancers. Those are the ones that you find in vaccines like Gardasil, because if you vaccinate people against so as they don't get them, it decreases the incidence of cancers like cervical cancer. Because there are some of these that are, if you have it, you're significantly increasing the risk of getting those types of cancers. The Gardasil vaccine is a quadrivalent vaccine. It's type 6, 11, 16, and 18. Why 6, 11, 16, and 18? Because 6, 11, 16, and 18 are the most common ones associated with increased incidence of cervical cancer. All right. Then we're going to talk about common cold a little bit. So there's some different viruses that can cause common cold. There's the rhinovirus, coronaviruses. There's a bunch of coronaviruses. SARS-CoV-2 is coronavirus, but there's a bunch of other coronaviruses too that cause symptoms of cold. They're not as anywhere near as transmissible as SARS-CoV-2. Transmitted nasal secretions, airborne transmission, potentially by droplets, contamination on hands. Sneeze your hand, shake somebody's hand, they just rub their nose, like that. Fomites, same kind of thing. Somebody sneezes in their hand, touch a doorknob, you touch the doorknob, you rub your face, things like that. But they're caused by some different viruses. Rhinoviruses and coronaviruses being the most prevalent ones causing the common cold. And then you have herpes, hepatitis viruses. So hepatitis viruses aren't necessarily related to each other. So there are hepatitis viruses, I think it goes up to J, maybe or something. The higher the letter, the more rare they are. Hence why I don't remember. up to, I can't remember, maybe it's not J, but you get up around J, there's been like one case of J. I mean, the further down the alphabet you go, the less likely of ever coming across it becomes. The ones that are more common, and the reason they're all grouped like this is because they impact the liver, so they're all hepatitis viruses. But genetically, they're not necessarily really related to one another. It's just that group them in one big group because they impact the liver and they're similar kind of mechanism. Hepatitis A and hepatitis B, there's a combo vaccine for that. We talked about that the other day, and those people are vaccinated against that now. Hep A is an RNA virus, Hep B is a DNA virus. You get Hep A from contaminated water and food, so you get them from vehicles. Again, I gave this example the other day. Go to Chipotle, somebody goes to the bathroom, doesn't wash your hands, come back, somebody makes a burrito. Hep A burrito, yay! So basically, we're vaccinated against that. Hep B, you get from as a sexually transmitted disease, or through like needle sticks and things like that. Most people are vaccinated against that. Hepatitis C, you get again from things like needle sticks, and it's a sexually transmitted infection. There is a therapy for that now. There's not a vaccine for Hep C, but for people that have Hep C, there is a very expensive therapy that will most likely eradicate that Hep C virus. I can't remember how much it costs now, but at one point it was like 120 grand. Yeah, it's 6 figures. So if you can afford 120 G's, you get rid of your Hep C, you get rid of your Hep C. If you have Hep C and you don't have 120 grand, you're going to get to keep your Hep C. American medicine, yeah. Sometimes some insurance plans will cover it, yes. Some of them will. Some of them will not. Exactly. Yeah. It's kind of like buying a car. You can buy a Mercedes, you can buy a 1973 like Pinto. Or, I mean, yeah. Some insurance laws that cover some of them. So people that have this is pretty prevalent. Baby boomers is a high population in that age group that has this. But there is treatment for it, but it is not affordable, I guess would be a nice way to put it. Hep D, Hep E, Hep F and G. Again, as you go down through these more, they get more and more and more rare. And then you have enteroviruses, which impact your gastrointestinal tract. Usually get through waterborne, they're in the water. Waterborne. Rotaviruses. Rotaviruses were one of the main causes of death in infants before, I can't remember what year that vaccine came out. I want to say 90, no, that's not right. 2006, I think. So Children's Hospital of Philadelphia came up with a vaccine for rotavirus because the amount of infants that were dying from essentially diarrhea from rotaviruses was very high. They came out with this vaccine, and those cases literally dropped down through the floor. You don't see this very much anymore. It does not exist in people that are vaccinated against it. But before the vaccine, there was about 55,000 hospitalizations a year just for kids less than 5. That's not including ones more than 5. So, and I can't remember how many that it killed a significant amount of young kids. I can't remember how many though. Noroviruses we talked about, again, close quarters. That's going to spread through aerosolization of fecal material, and also from people vomiting can aerosolize that as well. And if you're in a closed confined space, it spreads very easily. Makes what they say.
Yeah. Is hand, foot, and mouth an enterovirus?
Yes. Yeah, that is enterovirus if I remember right. Yeah. You will see that sometimes. You'll see that in daycares. You see that every time I go pick up my kids. It's like, oh, I see a case. It's like, come on. It's like, okay, let's go. Polio. I hope you don't see polio. I think you're probably going to see polio. Polio in recent history was globally eradicated except for 3 places on the surface of this planet: Nigeria, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. The Nigerian government had a very, very aggressive vaccine campaign to where they pretty much wiped it out. I think it was down to like 12 to 18 cases a year or something. And the cases that you saw were from the Savin vaccine. We'll talk about that in a moment. Afghanistan and Pakistan, there's a lot of remote areas in Afghanistan and Pakistan. It's hard to get the vaccine in all those different environments. And if you have different areas that are in conflict and there's wars, you can't get the vaccine to them. So it looked like for a long time we were going to get the vaccines into those two countries, and polio was going to go the way of smallpox and be gone. But when you have kind of increases in people not wanting to take vaccines, I have a feeling that this one's probably going to come. Transmitted through contaminated water or food. It's a fecal oral route, so that's exactly what it sounds like. Somebody shits it in their feces, and somehow some of that fecal material, polio, ends up in something that somebody consumes, and that's the mechanism by which it's spread. Vaccine type commonly found in municipal water, multiplies in throat and intestinal mucosa, targets and kills motor neurons, and what happens is you can have something called post-polio syndrome. Everybody know who Donald Sutherland is, the actor? Goes the old guy in Hunger Games. What's the guy's name? Snow, yeah, Snow. So, this will show you how old I am. I would always say, oh, it's the guy, it's the professor in Animal House, and he reaches up to the cereal and he's like, there. Yeah. That's awesome. But as you know, since I'm old as freaking dirt apparently, it's the old guy from Hunger Games. So he actually had polio. So he had some neuromuscular problems, which you could never really tell from seeing, but he had some neuromuscular problems with like his gait and stuff, so he's had some issues over the years. So that even after the polio is gone, those neuromuscular kind of problems, they last. They persist. So that's called post-polio syndrome. It's like a long-term sequelae. 2 vaccines, the Sabin vaccine and the Salk vaccine. The Sabin vaccine is what we used to give in the United States. Yeah.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but like if polio is transmitted by contaminated water food, then Ebola starts the same way because it was contaminated with water. Because they had that around.
Ebola is usually spread through more direct contact, not. So can it spread like you're saying? Yes, but I'm trying to remember this. From some of the really old cases of Ebola, from what I remember, it's been a long time since I looked at these. I think what they realized is you'd be like in a village, and they would have a well here, and there'd be a spot where you had a bunch of people that passed away, and they dug graves for them, and they put them in the graves, and if those graves were close enough proximity to the water source, from what I remember, it's been a long time. But yes, that is possible. The Sabin vaccine is attenuated, so it's just like we talked about MMR. That's a weakened version of the vaccine. That's the sugar cube one. So it's oral, more risk, but it's, if you have that one, you're immune against polio. The problem with that is, or I guess I would start with good things about that. The good thing about that is you don't need a minus 80-degree freezer and all this stuff. You can throw sugar cubes in a paper bag and take them and give them to people. So they're not hard to transport, so it's easier to disseminate. It's also not as expensive because you don't have to maintain a minus 80-degree freezer and do all this stuff. It's sugar cubes. So that's easy. The problem with it is you have somebody that's immunocompromised or just incredibly unlucky for whatever reason, and you give them the Sabin vaccine, you could potentially give them polio. So I cannot remember the person's name. It was a younger guy, maybe not so young now, but young in 2006. This is before around 2006. It was a person in the United States. He took the Sabin vaccine and then got polio. So like has permanent neuromuscular problems. His one leg, I can't remember which left or right, but it's like permanently atrophied. So he got polio. He lobbied the Congress for years, trying to get them to get rid of the Sabin vaccine, switch to the Salk, and finally, a few years before 2006, they actually finally went along with that, and then that Sabin vaccine went off the market, and the one we did in the United States now is the Salk vaccine, which is fine here, it's more expensive, but we have more access to minus 80 freezers and stuff, it's easier to disseminate. If you're in a country that's resource limited, that doesn't have a ton of money or the ability to transport vaccines that way, you're stuck with the Sabin vaccine. So like the Nigerian government, so we're going back to that, they use the Sabin vaccines, those 12 to 18 cases you see here in Nigeria, they're from the Sabin vaccine. They're not from the people getting polio. So that's what they get the vaccine. That's where you get kind of a pickle. So it's like you give it anything or not, well, you can't really get the salt disseminated well, so you're stuck with the Sabin, knowing that you're going to give a percentage of the population polio. Because it's attenuated. Yeah. Huh? Yeah, it's because, so it's a weakened form of the virus, so I mean, it's active. The Sabin one's inactivated. I mean, that it cannot replicate. So.
Are there any treatments or ways to manage it in people?
I can't remember what the treatment is. I mean, it's supportive. I mean, it's nothing to cure it.
That's allowed.
No. I mean, there's nothing to really do about it. You can supportive therapy. So that's kind of the sticky wicket with polio. And then you have antivirus, which actually is the one that just, this is the one that killed Gene Hackman here recently. Okay, let me think of a movie that's not older than 20 years that Gene Hackman was in. Yeah, he's been retired I think for like 20 years, so I don't even know. What was Gene Hackman in? Yeah, but like that was an old Superman.
What's his name?
Gene Hackman. Yeah, Hackman. So what happened?
Literally nothing recent. You know where he was? Oh, he was on the road.
I don't remember that. But what happens is you get mice that can carry this. Usually somebody goes up into the attic or something where there's dry feces and they can inhale it. And then you get this hemorrhagic renal syndrome. If you're in Asia, that's how the symptoms occur. The United States usually involves the lungs, and it can result in, that's how much wipe it.
Is this guy like Rivers Walking?
Yep. Oh yeah, oh wait, it didn't kill him, it killed his wife, and then it killed his wife, yeah, you're right, sorry. Yeah, it killed his wife, and she was a caretaker, and I think he had like late dementia or something. So I think he must have starved to death or something. Yeah, she was taking care of him, I think essentially he didn't know where he was, and
They said you got it with some like gardening.
I don't know, potentially. Usually people get it where there's a lot of like rat and mouse species. Like there'll be an attic and nobody's been in for 15 years. Somebody goes up into the attic and they breathe it in. So that's hantavirus. You see that referred to as sometimes sin nombres, a nameless virus. Usually you inhale it through dried out urine or mouse species. So a little bit of kind of more contemporary examples of that one. Rabies we talked about in here actually a little bit. So that's a zoonotic virus. It has a potential to travel to the neurons, to the nervous system, up to the brain, so it's neurotropic. Death results from destruction of regions of the brain that regulate breathing so that people can't breathe anymore. You can't really test for this, like if a rabid animal bites somebody, and the way you actually demonstrate that that animal has rabies is you have to do a necropsy of the brain. So they literally decapitate the animal, send that animal head to the Department of Health of the state, and then they do histopathology on the brain tissue to see if they can find rabies virus. You can't test for it without it.
What are you testing for at that point? You already killed the dog. To see if she
I
got
know,
it.
that was kind of always my thought, it's the only test we have essentially. It's just like, you gotta look at the brain tissue and they're like, okay, I mean, how? Yeah, I know.
So I know like one of the symptoms of the rabies is like the fear of water. Like what's caused why the animal or person be like very scared?
The parts of the brain that it's targeting, they're involved in like thirst and, I don't know.
How common is this?
I don't know, here I'm starting to really wonder about that because there's a lot of rabid animals around this campus. No one seen that the other day, it was like last week. The raccoons, yeah, they were out there, they looked like they were tanked, they looked like they were drunk. They get something called ataxia, which means you stumble around, and the raccoons were going like this in broad daylight. Raccoons are not drunks. They're out at nighttime. They're not out at 1 afternoon like they just out for grazing. What's up?
So, the most common carriers for rabies are the raccoons, actually. And it's typically just seen in them, but opossums and animals that have a really low body temperature can't get it. It's not super common, but I know there's been an uptick in a couple states of rabid deers and things being seen.
Yeah,
But
that's
typically,
a
a
lot.
lot of veterinary clinics only see like 1 to 2 a year. So
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
not super
It's
duper
not
common.
super common. Out west, sometimes you'll see populations of like raccoons and things will have this. What the, like DNR or whatever for those states, they'll throw out essentially like little trees that have the vaccine in it, like they'll call it like vaccine laden dates or something, they'll blow it out at them. And then what happens is the ones that have rabies will die because if the disease process is progressed enough for the vaccine will no longer be effective, they will die. And the other ones that have not been exposed to it, or the disease process hasn't progressed that far, they will become vaccinated. So you get rid of it that way. There's a reason for that, I'll tell you later. Yeah.
So it says, while rabies is uncommon in humans, 3 out of 4 Americans live in a community where raccoons, skunks, or foxes carry this deadly disease. Around 4,000 animal rabies cases are reported each year, with more than 90% occurring in wildlife where bats, raccoons, skunks.
Yeah, bats are pretty common too.
They're big.
Yeah. Bats are a big one. Like coming down Space Fireplace or something, which I realize we don't see as much here because not many people have a fireplace when it's like 103 degrees all the time. Kind of redundant. Yes, bats can carry it. Yeah, I think they don't know about that.
I remember reading like some papers on it because, but they said the bats usually are pretty good at just being carriers. So that's why like no matter what the vaccine should.
That doesn't make sense. I don't know.
It has to do something with their immune system. Their immune system is pretty interesting. They've got an interesting immune system, like in my opinion. So they don't. That's why they carry a lot of diseases versus like actually being affected.
Okay, so nobody touch bats, they carry 130.
The first day I was ever on this campus, I was driving down the road, it was like a 1 afternoon, I was loop around the campus, and a raccoon just walked out the road. I mean, almost falling over, I was like, and then last week, I saw the raccoons last week, yeah. I have no idea who to call here yet, because I haven't been here that long. But I mean, yeah, they were, I guess they were like walked into a wall. Like, there was, so somebody had asked if they went to go to Giselle, and I was like, ask Giselle to call. I really don't want to do a call, I can't control it. On occasion, you'll have somebody that wants to go play with the cute raccoon or something that's out stumbling around at 2 in the afternoon on a sunny day. Don't do that. Because getting the rabies vaccine is not a pleasant experience, so I've heard. The one good thing, okay, good things and bad things about rabies. I guess I can tell you this. There have been some people that have survived this without necessarily having a vaccine. There's been something called the Milwaukee treatment. Induced coma, passive immunization against the rabies virus, antioxidants, and enzyme CoQ10. The one thing that's not listed on here they usually do is they drop the body temperature lower down, and that has been shown to work infrequently. The way you usually can treat this is if somebody was bitten with something they think might be rabid, they go to the hospital, they get the rabies vaccine. The rabies virus is one of few pathogens that you can vaccinate for after you're actually exposed to it. The reason for that is the rabies virus replicates really, really slow. So if you get the vaccine, your immune response can develop an immunity before the rabies virus has had enough time to actually replicate enough to actually cause rabies. With a little bit of caveat. The closer to your central nervous system, to your brain that you're bitten, the faster that disease progress is going to progress. So if the similar raccoon out here bites you on the big toe, it's going to take a while for that to get up to your you're in the central nervous system, if they bite you on the throat, that's not a good thing. For numerous reasons. But the closer to your brain it is, not good. Okay. Almost there, promise. Then you have your arthropod-borne diseases, so there's more than this, but here's some bottom examples. You have arboviruses transmitted by blood-sucking arthropods, so things like mosquitoes. They don't produce it doesn't produce the disease in the vector, but it produces the disease in us. And I talked about this the other day. The reason for that is these diseases, part of their life cycle involves these vectors. So they don't really exist if these vectors are gone. That's why we talk a lot in Southwest Florida, down in the Keys, about controlling the mosquitoes and wiping them out, because no mosquitoes, no disease. Where else do mosquitoes play a role in the food chain around here? I don't think we necessarily know that, so that's why we get a little bit nervous about wiping them all out, because we don't know what's going to happen. Like maybe the whole food chain collapses, we don't know. So but some different mosquitoes can carry these different kinds of viruses. Yellow fever is called yellow fever because it causes jaundice, it makes you turn yellow, it causes a fever. You see this in places like South America and Africa, certain parts of Africa, and it infects primates. We are primates. Yellow fever and dengue are transmitted by mosquitoes in the genus Aedes. Aedes aegypti is one of the more common ones. There are some other species. Aedes albopictus, Aedes aegypti tends to be the most common one that you see associated with transmitting some of the nasty things. Dengue you find in places like parts of South America and parts of Asia. That causes something called great bone fever because it hurts so bad it feels like somebody's breaking your bones. So that is dengue virus. Humans are the reservoir for that. Also transmitted through Aedes mosquito bite. For these things, we're generally accidental hosts or incidental hosts for all intents and purposes in here. Those are the same thing. So we're not part of these viruses' life cycle, anything to do with it. It's just the mosquito has it, and well, they bit us. So now we have it too. That's why if you're traveling to some of these areas where you find these kinds of viruses, they usually give you a vaccine exist, they vaccinate you against these two. West Nile virus is carried through the Culex mosquito, and that can cause West Nile virus. And you find that in humans where. So this is why, not for yellow fever and dengue, but for like West Nile, as we notice more and more warmer conditions, what has happened is there are some of the things that exist in the Caribbean that we're worried about finding its way slowly up through here in Miami and places like that have a similar climate. Like the mosquitoes, if they find their way here and they're carrying some of these things, like chikungunya and viruses like that, then you get chikungunya. That's why you see the helicopter from Lee County going zoom, 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 and spraying all the mosquitoes. It's trying to keep those mosquito populations low because they carry a lot of things. All right, enough of viruses. Let's talk about prions a little bit. We talked about them. All right. So prion diseases. So prions are misshapen proteins that find their way into your brain and interact with the correctly folded protein, causing that correctly folded protein to misfold as well and cause something called amyloid plaques. So these cause these amyloid fibers and they line up in plaques, and they start to damage neurological tissue, and they cause the disease process called spongiform encephalopathy. So what that means, you take a section of the brain from one of these individuals who's passed away from a prion disease, and you see little pockets where there's no cells, where there should be neurological tissue. So it looks like a sponge. And that's why it's called a spongiform encephalopathy, because it's the pathology of the cerebral cortex. So it makes your cerebral cortex look like a sponge. Different examples of this, most of you have heard of these, whether you were aware or not. But mad cow disease, Kuru, the chronic wasting disease in deer that you see now, scrapie and sheep. We'll talk about a little bit some of those. These are fatal if you have one of these. There's nothing there to support care. There's nothing they can really do. Can cause dementia, motor dysfunction. Essentially, you start to have a lot of damage to your central nervous system. Anytime you see this protein name, PRP, C means it's the one that you normally find. That's the protein you find in your brain. That is normal. If you see any letters after PRP besides C, it's some kind of prion disease. PRPSC is straight prion. PRPK is Kuru, I think. I don't remember what mad cow disease is, because it's not MC. I feel like it's B, something for bovine, I can't remember. But essentially anything that's not C after PRP means it's prion disease. You find these again in the brain. Somehow one of these misfolded ones finds its way to the brain. It interacts with the correctly folded one, causes them to misfold as well, and you get these big buildup of plaques. Same thing we talked about. But I'll talk about these here a little bit more. So the different diseases you see with this. Kuru, we initially found with Papua New Guinea. What happened is part of their, I want to talk about this here too, is part of their funeral process. They would actually do something called funeral cannibalism, where they cannibalized their relatives that died. Until very recently, I thought that was the whole thing.